It is just before sunrise. The year is 1536. You are standing on the south bank of the River Thames, looking north across the water at London, and the first thing you notice is the silence. Not complete silence. You can hear the river moving. You can hear a dog somewhere, a church bell marking the early hour. But compared to what this city will become in later centuries, it is quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to a city that has not yet woken up. The skyline in front of you is low and dark against the early sky. Dozens of church towers and spires rise above the rooftops, more churches per square mile than almost any city in Europe. And above all of them, dominating everything, the massive bulk of old St. Paul's Cathedral sitting on the highest ground in the city, its enormous square tower, visible from miles in every direction. This is London in 1536, a city of around 70,000 people, the capital of a kingdom that is right now, at this exact moment in history, going through one of the most dramatic and violent periods of transformation it has ever experienced. The king is Henry VIII. He has just broken with the Catholic Church, declared himself the head of a new Church of England, and is in the process of systematically stripping the monasteries and religious houses that have defined the physical and spiritual landscape of this city for centuries. One of his wives, Anne Boleyn, will be executed this very year on Tower Green. The city is tense. The city is watching. The city is changing. But the city is also, on this particular Tuesday morning, simply getting on with it, because that is what cities do. People still need to eat, traders still need to sell, craftsmen still need to work, and the streets of Tudor London are about to fill up with all of it. In this video, we are going deep into one day in this city. We are going to look at what these streets were actually made of, how the buildings were constructed, what the city smelled like and sounded like, what ordinary people were doing from the moment they woke up to the moment they went to sleep. We are going to walk through the markets, the river, the great buildings, the taverns, the workshops, and the courts. We are going to look at this city from the ground up, brick by timber by cobblestone. Everything you are seeing on screen right now has been reconstructed using advanced AI technology, historical maps, contemporary illustrations, architectural surveys, parish records, and Tudor-era written accounts have all been used to rebuild London exactly as it appeared in 1536. Every street, every building, every detail is drawn from real historical documentation. This is Tudor London, and this is what it actually looked like. Before we walk the streets, you need to understand the shape of this city, because Tudor London was physically very different from any version of London that came after it. The city in 1536 was small by later standards. Almost everything that mattered happened within a roughly 1 mile square area on the north bank of the Thames. This was the area enclosed by the old Roman and medieval city walls, a circuit of stone that still stood in 1536, punctuated by a series of gatehouses that controlled entry into the city from every direction. Aldgate to the east, Bishopsgate to the northeast, Moorgate and Cripplegate to the north, Aldersgate and Newgate to the northwest, Ludgate to the west. These gates were not just entry points, they were substantial stone structures, some of them multi-story, housing guards, administrative functions, and in some cases prisoners in cells above the gate arch. The walls themselves were still largely intact, built originally by the Romans and reinforced and repaired through the medieval period. They formed a genuine physical boundary around the city. Beyond the walls, in the areas known as the Liberties and the suburbs, London was already spreading. Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames, sat outside city jurisdiction entirely and operated by its own rules. To the west, the road toward Westminster led through open fields and scattered buildings toward the Royal Palace at Whitehall. But the core of the city, the London that mattered commercially and politically, sat within those walls. And inside those walls, the city was extraordinarily dense. 70,000 people packed into 1 square mile. To put that in perspective, that is a density comparable to parts of modern Manhattan, but without running water, without sewers, without street lighting, without any of the infrastructure that makes dense urban living bearable. Now let us look at the buildings, because this is where Tudor London really comes to life visually, and it looked nothing like what most people picture when they think of a historical city. The dominant building material in London in 1536 was timber, not stone. Timber. The great majority of buildings in the city were timber-framed structures built using a technique that had been standard in England for centuries. These buildings were not small. In the dense commercial streets of central London, they were typically 3 or 4 stories tall, and they had a very specific visual characteristic that you need to understand. Each upper floor projected outward over the floor below it. This projection was called a jetty. The first floor jettied out over the ground floor. The second floor jettied out further still over the first. By the time you reached the third or fourth floor, the building had extended several feet out from its original ground floor footprint. On a narrow street with buildings on both sides doing this, the effect was that the upper floors of the buildings on opposite sides of the street nearly met overhead, blocking out much of the sky and creating a dark, enclosed tunnel of a street at ground level. This jettied construction was not purely decorative, it was structural. By cantilevering each floor out over the one below, builders could create more floor space on the upper levels without needing to expand the foundations, which in the dense city was often impossible anyway. It also had the practical effect of providing some protection from rain for people walking at street level beneath the overhanging floors. The Thames in 1536 was not just a geographical feature of the city, it was the city's main street. Goods arriving in London came by boat. Coal, grain, wine, timber. All of it came up the Thames to the wharves clustered along the North Bank. Hundreds of small boats called wherries operated as water taxis, carrying passengers up and down the river and between the two banks. And then there was London Bridge, the only crossing of the Thames in London in 1536, and it looked nothing like what most people picture when they hear the word bridge. London Bridge was covered from one end to the other with buildings, timber-framed houses and shops built directly on the bridge structure, 3 and 4 stories tall, hanging out over the river on both sides. Walking across it, you would have had almost no sense of being over water at all. You were simply walking down a very narrow street. At the Southwark end, above the gatehouse, the heads of executed traitors were displayed on poles, preserved in tar. In 1536, this was official, deliberate, and very public. In the political climate of Henry's reign, with opposition to his religious reforms being dealt with harshly, those poles were not empty. The sun is up now and London is moving. The first sounds are the church bells. London in 1536 had over 100 parish churches within the city walls. Their bells marked every hour and called people to services throughout the day. The first people in the streets were the water carriers. There was no piped water supply in Tudor London. Fresh water came from public conduits, fountains fed by lead pipes bringing water in from springs outside the walls. Water carriers collected it and hauled it through the city for those who could pay. Close behind them came the street sellers, women selling fresh milk straight from the cow, carrying it in pails on wooden yokes, bread sellers with baskets of loaves, fishmongers setting up at fixed spots along the main streets. By mid-morning, Cheapside was at full intensity, goldsmiths at the western end, drapers selling cloth further east, grocers, mercers, haberdashers, all with their established areas. The street was wide enough for carts to pass, but only just, and the combination of pedestrians, animals, and traders made moving through it at any speed a test of patience. Beyond Cheapside, the city had specialized markets, each focused on specific goods and each with its own character. Smithfield, just outside the city walls to the northwest, was the live animal market. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses were driven in from the surrounding countryside and sold here on market days. Drovers pushing livestock through the narrow city streets to reach Smithfield meant that encountering a herd of cattle in the middle of a commercial lane was a completely normal event in Tudor London. Billingsgate on the north bank of the Thames, just east of the bridge, was the fish market. Boats brought catches directly to the quayside, and sellers spread their stock out for early morning buyers. The smell of Billingsgate on a warm day was, by all contemporary accounts, something that announced itself well before you arrived. Leadenhall Market in the east dealt in poultry, dairy, and grain, operating from a covered market building that provided some shelter and organisation that the open street markets completely lacked. Tudor London in 1536 was a city in the middle of a transformation it did not fully understand yet. The religious changes were dismantling institutions that had defined the city for centuries. The population was growing. The streets were getting more crowded. Within 10 years, the monasteries would be gone. Within 130 years, almost every timber-framed building we have walked through in this video would be gone, burned in the Great Fire of 1666 that swept through the city in 3 days and destroyed most of medieval London permanently. The Tudor city of 1536, those jettied timber buildings leaning over narrow streets, the open-fronted shops on Cheapside, the heads above the bridge gate, the monks still in their precincts, the watermen on the Thames, all of it was living on borrowed time. It would not last. But on this particular Tuesday morning in 1536, it was completely, noisily, and entirely alive. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe to the channel. We cover history like this every week with the same depth and detail. There is a lot more coming. We will see you in the next one.